At the previous level, we encountered an uncomfortable truth. Control rarely appears as an attack. It does not require violence. It does not rely on threats. It arrives in the form of familiarity, of comfort, of things repeated long enough to no longer seem worthy of question. And for that very reason, it is accepted. Not because it is right, but because it makes us feel at ease. But tonight, as we go one step deeper, something more subtle begins to reveal itself. When awareness fades, control no longer needs reason. It only needs emotion. Carl Gustav Jung understood the power of emotion in psychological life with great clarity. He did not view human beings as creatures guided primarily by reason, but by currents of emotional energy operating beneath the surface of consciousness. Jung wrote, "Emotion is the chief source of all becoming conscious. Yet here lies the paradox. The very thing that has the power to awaken consciousness is also the easiest to manipulate when it is not recognized. Emotion, when unobserved, does not need arguments to persuade. It only needs to be triggered. When reason is awake, control must justify itself. It must offer reasons. It must tell a story. But when awareness grows dim, everything becomes far simpler. A fleeting sense of anxiety, a nameless fear, a familiar surge of anger, a vague feeling of guilt. These emotions do not need to be right or wrong. They only need to be familiar enough to be trusted. Jung called these trigger points complexes, autonomous emotional structures capable of seizing control of the mind without the permission of consciousness. He wrote, "Complexes are autonomous psychic entities. When a complex is activated, reason is no longer at the helm. It arrives afterward, to legitimize what emotion has already decided. We believe we are reasoning, but in truth, we are rationalizing. We believe we are choosing, but in reality, we are reacting. And because that reaction carries the color of familiar emotion, it does not feel coerced. It feels like us." Jung warned, people do not have ideas. Ideas have people. And in much the same way, human beings do not simply have emotions. Very often, emotions have human beings. What makes this layer of control dangerous is not the intensity of emotion, but its invisibility. When an emotion becomes a habitual rhythm, we no longer call it an emotion. We call it personality, a natural reflex. That's just the way I am. And at that point, control no longer needs to intervene from the outside. It has been fully internalized. Jung did not ask us to suppress emotion in order to regain freedom. On the contrary, he believed that freedom begins only when we dare to look directly at our emotional life without identifying with it. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. When emotion is brought into the light of awareness, it loses its unconditional authority. It becomes a signal, no longer a command. And this is the deeper step of awakening, not controlling emotion, but recognizing when emotion is controlling us. When that moment occurs, even briefly, control begins to fracture, not through reason, but through presence. And when we see that control can operate purely through emotion, without reason as a mediator, the final illusion begins to reveal itself. The belief that human beings are primarily rational actors. The human mind loves to tell itself a comforting story, that we weigh evidence, analyze data, and then arrive at decisions carefully and logically. This story makes us feel mature, autonomous, and reliable. But Carl Gustav Jung saw a far less comfortable truth. Much of human life is not guided by reason, but by emotions that have already seized control. Reason, in many cases, arrives afterward, to explain what has already happened. When emotion takes the wheel, reason becomes a passenger. It is still there. It still speaks. It still offers arguments, but it no longer determines direction. You do not do something because it is reasonable. You do it because not doing it becomes emotionally unbearable. A fear compels avoidance. A sense of guilt forces compliance. And anxiety pushes you to act quickly, even when you do not yet understand why. And then reason appears like a diligent lawyer, constructing arguments that sound perfectly rational to justify a choice already made by emotion. Jung understood this mechanism deeply because he did not approach the mind as a logical machine, but as an ecosystem of psychological energy. He wrote, "Emotion is the chief source of all becoming conscious. Emotion is the source from which consciousness arises. But when emotions are not brought into the light of awareness, they do not simply fade. They accumulate, they demand, and eventually they rule." Jung warned that what is left unattended in the unconscious does not weaken. On the contrary, it becomes autonomous. He called these complexes independent psychological entities and stated plainly, complexes are autonomous psychic entities. A complex does not need to debate with you. It does not need to persuade. It only needs to activate the nervous system. When that happens, the body reacts before the mind can understand what is occurring. The heart races, the body tenses, the breath becomes shallow. In that state, reason has no ground to stand on. You are not convinced by ideas. You are overwhelmed by sensation. And this is the most powerful form of control. Not controlling your thoughts, but making resistance emotionally unbearable. Jung once remarked, with bitter precision, "People do not have ideas. Ideas have people." And this is even more true of emotion. Human beings do not have emotions in the sense of ownership. Very often, emotions have human beings. When an old fear is triggered, you are no longer the adult of the present. You become the child of memory. When a familiar anger arises, you are no longer free to choose your response. You are simply replaying a script written long ago. The danger lies in this. The state does not feel coercive. It feels authentic, personal. Me. And because of that, we rarely question it. We believe we are acting from our nature. Jung called this identification with the unconscious, when the ego mistakes emotional energy for identity. He warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. But Jung was not pessimistic. He did not believe human beings were condemned to be slaves to emotion. He simply reminded us that reason cannot regain control by arguing with emotion. Emotion does not listen to logic. It softens only when it is seen, acknowledged, and named. When an emotion is made conscious, it no longer floods the entire nervous system. It becomes a signal, not a command. And this is the subtle yet decisive shift. From believing I am my reason to recognizing I am the one who can observe both reason and emotion. Jung saw this moment as the beginning of inner freedom. Not freedom from emotion, but freedom from being ruled by emotion in the dark. When the light of awareness appears, even the strongest emotion loses its absolute authority. And when we have seen that emotion can take the wheel and push reason into the passenger seat, one particular emotion begins to reveal itself. Not loud, not explosive, but more persistent than most others. Guilt. Guilt is a strange emotion. It does not attack. It does not shout. It does not coerce through direct fear. It whispers. Its voice is quiet but steady. You owe something. You should do better. You are responsible for this pain. And because this voice sounds so much like our own inner voice, we rarely question where it comes from. Carl Gustav Jung understood that emotions operating in silence are often the ones with the deepest power. Once guilt is accepted, obedience no longer needs to be imposed. It arises naturally. No one needs to give orders. No one needs to watch over you. You regulate yourself. You pressure yourself to do this, or avoid that, not because you believe it is right, but because you cannot tolerate the heaviness inside. And so action no longer arises from free choice, but from the desire to feel relief. Jung warned, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." When guilt operates in the unconscious, it does not feel like control. It feels like conscience. The Stoic philosophers recognized this dangerous confusion very early on. They drew a clear distinction between morality and guilt. Morality, for them, meant acting in accordance with reason and virtue. Guilt was something else entirely. It does not guide you toward right action. It punishes you for failing to meet a standard, often a standard absorbed from the outside. Epictetus reminded us, "It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them." And guilt, at its deepest level, is precisely a judgment turned inward, labeling the person you are as at fault. Jung saw guilt as a form of trapped psychological energy. It does not resolve ethical questions. It merely sustains pressure. And pressure, when prolonged, produces perfect compliance. You no longer need to be controlled because you have learned to monitor yourself. You no longer need to be punished because you already carry the punishment in your mind. Jung wrote, "Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering." Guilt often functions as substitute suffering, a form of pain that does not lead to growth, but only to submission. What makes guilt particularly dangerous is that it is often disguised as morality. We are taught that if we feel guilty, it means we are good. That guilt proves we have a conscience. But both Jung and the Stoics would pause here. Morality does not require continuous self-punishment. Morality requires awareness. When an emotion causes you to shrink, to act out of fear rather than understanding, it is no longer morality. It is internalized control. Once someone has learned how to induce guilt, power is no longer necessary. This is the pinnacle of subtle control, transferring discipline from the outside to the inside. Jung described this as a false identification with moral complexes, when the ego believes that self-inflicted suffering is proof of responsibility. But true responsibility, in Jung's view, is always accompanied by consciousness. And consciousness cannot arise from blind self-condemnation. Guilt does not ask what you should do next. It only asks where you are wrong. And when the mind is trapped in that second question, it has no energy left for living. Jung emphasized that psychological transformation does not come from carrying more guilt, but from understanding what is happening within. He wrote, "What you resist persists. Guilt that is repressed does not disappear. It merely changes form and continues to control from the shadows." The Stoics did not teach people to feel more guilt. They taught people to discern, to distinguish between what lies within one's control and what does not, between mistakes that require correction and emotions that simply need to be released. And Jung, from a different path, arrived at the same conclusion. Inner freedom begins when we realize that not every heavy feeling is the voice of truth. When guilt is faced directly, neither indulged nor suppressed, it loses its secret power. It is no longer a command. It becomes a signal to be understood and then released. And in that moment, automatic obedience comes to an end, not because you rebel, but because you no longer confuse inner pressure with morality. And when guilt has become strong enough to make a person discipline their own behavior, a deeper layer of control begins to take shape, one that no longer targets what you do, but strikes directly at who you believe you are. If guilt whispers, "You did something wrong," then shame delivers a far heavier sentence, "You are wrong." This difference may sound subtle, but in Carl Gustav Jung's depth psychology, it marks the boundary between behavior and identity. Behavior can be corrected. Identity, when condemned, collapses inward to protect itself. And it is in that moment of contraction that shame begins to rule. Shame does not argue. It does not present reasons. It creates an atmosphere. Within that atmosphere, speaking becomes dangerous, because to speak is to expose, and exposure carries the risk of rejection. Jung understood this mechanism deeply. He observed that shame does not destroy the unacceptable parts of a person. It pushes them further down into the shadow of the unconscious, where they do not disappear, but grow stronger. Jung wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. When a part of the self is labeled not allowed to exist, it does not dissolve. It accumulates energy, and repressed energy, Jung believed, always finds a way back, often in more distorted and uncontrollable forms. A person carrying shame does not rise to object. They withdraw, not because they agree, but because they do not dare to be present. They learn to be silent. They learn to shrink. They learn to become invisible so they do not have to face the gaze of others, and eventually, the gaze of themselves. Jung recognized that prolonged silence is not peace. It is the sign of an ego protecting itself from the pain of exclusion. In this state, control no longer needs to command. It no longer needs to punish. Shame has already done its work, causing the person to remove themselves from shared space. And that withdrawal creates the perfect environment for control. There is no voice to challenge, no question to disturb the order, only silent compliance, disguised as introverted personality or maturity. Jung called this one of the great tragedies of modern psychological life, when people confuse hiding the shadow with transcending it. He warned, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Light does not come from becoming more perfect, but from allowing the shamed parts to step out of the darkness and be seen without judgment. Shame convinces people that if they were fully seen, they would no longer be loved. This belief cuts so deeply that they choose to disappear in fragments rather than risk being themselves. Jung understood that this fear of rejection is not a personal weakness, but a collective memory of the species, the memory of being cast out of the tribe. But he also emphasized that the cost of self-erasure is far greater. An ego living in shame does not seek truth. It seeks safety. And safety, in this case, means not disturbing anyone, not drawing attention, not asking questions. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, because such acceptance requires facing the risk of being seen and misunderstood." Yet Jung did not leave us in despair. He showed that the shadow is dangerous only when it is denied. When made conscious, it becomes a source of life rather than a threat. And the moment a person dares to speak what they were once ashamed of, not to be forgiven, but to be real, is the moment control begins to lose the environment it depends on. Because control needs silence to survive. And consciousness always begins with a small voice, trembling perhaps, but honest. And when shame has taught a person how to be silent and invisible, a final force quietly tightens the circle of control, not through commands, but through fear. Fear completes this triangle. It does not need to be loud. It does not require dramatic panic or explicit threats. It only needs to be constantly present, like a low, continuous hum in the mind. The fear of losing connection. The fear of being left alone. The fear of what might happen if you were to leave. And because these fears touch the deepest layers of our attachment instincts, we rarely name them. Instead, we call their consequences reality, wisdom, or safety. The Stoics understood well the contracting force of fear. They believed fear does not merely cause pain, it shrinks the soul. Seneca wrote, "Fear keeps pace with hope." When fear dominates, the future ceases to be a space for living and becomes a threat to be avoided. Vision narrows. The capacity to imagine other possibilities is suffocated. Eventually, inner life is compressed into a single goal: survival. Carl Gustav Jung, from the depths of psychology, observed the same movement. He noted that fear, especially the fear of separation from the community, can govern human beings more powerfully than any doctrine. Jung wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important." The fear of isolation is not merely the fear of being alone, it is the fear of having no place where one can belong with one's whole self. When fear reigns, freedom no longer feels like freedom. It feels dangerous. Leaving is no longer a possibility. It becomes an unacceptable risk. And so people stay, not because they want to, but because staying feels safer than the unknown. Jung understood that many so-called reasonable human choices are in fact made in a state where fear has been normalized. He warned, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own souls. Facing the primal fear of losing connection requires far more courage than remaining where one is. The subtlety of fear lies in this: it does not need to prove what will happen if you leave. It only needs to whisper that something bad might happen. And in the mind, might is already enough to freeze movement. The Stoics called this a confusion between impressions and reality. Epictetus reminded us, men are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of things. Fear operates through images of what has not yet occurred, but which are felt as if they are already present. Jung added another layer of depth. These fears often do not belong to the present at all. They are emotional memories from the past, moments of abandonment, rejection, or punishment for being different, reactivated in the present. In such moments, the ego is no longer responding to the current situation, but to the ghost of memory. Jung called this the takeover of complexes. And when a fear-based complex is activated, the future becomes locked into the shape of the past. At this point, the triangle of control closes. Guilt compels you to do what is right. Shame convinces you that you are wrong, and fear keeps you in place, afraid to step out. No prison is required. No chains are needed. Only the feeling that if you leave, you will lose everything. Jung recognized that the deepest dependency is not on people or circumstances, but on fear within. The Stoics did not deny fear. They did not ask human beings to become numb. They taught one essential skill: distinguishing between what lies within one's power and what does not. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." But to do this, one must accept a difficult truth. Freedom always comes with uncertainty, and uncertainty, for a soul contracted by fear, is the most uncomfortable state of all. Jung did not promise that stepping beyond fear would bring immediate safety. He simply said that remaining within fear causes the soul to grow smaller and smaller. He wrote, "Where your fear is, there is your task." Where fear persists most stubbornly is often where life has become stuck, not to be forced through, but to be understood, named, and met with conscious presence. When fear is looked at directly, it does not disappear at once, but it loses its monopoly. The future begins to open in small cracks. Possibilities once excluded as too dangerous are allowed to exist again, at least in imagination. And that is the first step of freedom, not action, but the capacity to imagine that one could act. People stay not because they are weak. They stay because fear has convinced them that safety matters more than vitality. Jung and the Stoics converge on a shared reminder: the soul does not die from suffering, but from contracting for too long. And the moment you recognize that fear is narrowing your life, even silently, is the moment the triangle of control begins to show its first cracks. And when fear becomes strong enough to make people stay, not because they want to, but because they no longer dare to leave, Jung leads us to a deeper, more unsettling realization. What happens when these emotions do not merely influence us, but begin to live in our place? Carl Gustav Jung wrote that when an emotion is not integrated into consciousness, it doesn't disappear. It splits off. It becomes autonomous. Jung did not present this as a metaphor, but as a psychological reality. He stated plainly, complexes are autonomous psychic entities. An emotion that is left unattended is no longer just an emotion. It becomes a center of power within the psyche. It begins to think for you, decide for you, and paradoxically, it always justifies itself as acting for your protection. Guilt, when not faced directly, does more than remind you of behavior. It issues commands. Submit. It convinces you that if you do not comply, you are a bad person. Shame, when pushed into the shadow, does more than hurt. It whispers, hide. It persuades you that your presence itself is a danger. Fear, when prolonged, does more than warn. It freezes. Do not move. And when these three emotions operate together, they form a complete system of control. No orders, no ruler, no prison required. Jung recognized this as the deepest form of compliance, when people no longer feel coerced, because every command now comes from within. And what is most unsettling, the person believes they are choosing this freely. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." When control arises from the unconscious, it does not feel like control. It feels reasonable. It can even feel moral. At this depth, reason is no longer a victim. It becomes an accomplice. It legitimizes. It explains. It tells stories that sound mature and responsible. I stay out of duty. I remain silent out of wisdom. I don't change because reality is harsh. Jung understood that this is not conscious deceit. It is the defense mechanism of a mind long accustomed to living under the rule of autonomous emotions. An autonomous emotion does not need to shout. It only needs to repeat itself. Repetition creates habit. Habit shapes identity. And identity then protects the system that gave birth to it. Jung called this state identification with the complex, when the ego merges with a complex. At that point, people no longer say, "I am afraid." They say, "I am cautious." They no longer say, "I feel ashamed." They say, "I am private." They no longer say, "I feel guilty." They say, "I am responsible." And so, the prison becomes invisible. Jung did not call this weakness. He called it lack of integration. Integration, reconciliation, is a central concept in Jungian psychology. An integrated emotion no longer rules. It becomes information, a signal, a part of the whole. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. When darkness is made conscious, it no longer needs to control from behind the scenes. But this process demands something most people avoid: sitting with an emotion without immediately acting on it. Not submitting, not escaping, not freezing, simply observing." Jung understood that only in such conscious presence does an emotion lose its autonomy and return to its proper place, as a part of psychological life, not its ruler. The painful truth is this: when someone begins to see this system operating within themselves, they do not immediately feel freer. They often feel exposed, because choices that once felt like my decisions begin to appear as old reflexes. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Acceptance here is not resignation. It is the courage to see the truth of how one has been living. Guilt, shame, and fear are not enemies to be destroyed. They were once signals with protective functions, but when they are not integrated, they become wardens. And the most dangerous warden is not the one who beats you, but the one who convinces you that no prison exists. Jung did not promise that integration would make life easier. He said it would make life real. When emotions are brought into the light, automatic compliance dissolves, not because you rebel, but because you are no longer confused. And in that moment, a very quiet possibility emerges: the capacity to choose, not from fear, not from shame, not from guilt, but from a self that is slowly becoming more whole. And when we have seen that unintegrated emotions can become autonomous, thinking for us, deciding for us, protecting us by imprisoning us, Jung invites us to look at the simplest image to understand why such control is so rarely recognized. Imagine wearing a thick coat in the heat. No one forces you to put it on. There is no command, no punishment. Yet when you think about taking it off, something suddenly feels wrong. A vague sensation arises: anxiety, unease, as if you were about to do something forbidden. And so you endure, you adapt. You call the heat normal. Carl Gustav Jung saw in this image the subtle mechanism of emotional control. It does not require obedience. It makes resistance emotionally too costly. That coat is not an object. It is guilt, shame, and fear that have been internalized. Each emotion adds another thick layer of fabric, initially seeming protective, but gradually making it impossible for the body to breathe. Jung wrote, "Complexes are autonomous psychic entities. When a complex has become autonomous, it no longer needs to justify its existence. It only needs to maintain the feeling that taking the coat off would be more dangerous than keeping it on. And so the ego chooses endurance, not because it prefers it, but because endurance feels safer than the vague risk of freedom." What is subtle here is this: there is no decisive moment. No, I chose to wear the coat, only a sequence of small adaptations, enduring a little longer, becoming a little more accustomed, rationalizing a little more. Jung warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. When discomfort becomes normalized, we no longer call it a chain. We call it personality, circumstance. That's just how life is. Emotion controls by assigning a price. It makes the cost of resistance so high that we do not dare to try. Taking the coat off might bring relief, but the price is the fear of exposure, rejection, being wrong. And the mind, which seeks balance, chooses the option with less conflict. Jung recognized that the ego rarely chooses what is right. It chooses what hurts less. He wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own souls." Facing the truth about the coat, that it is no longer necessary, requires accepting a moment of unease. And that unease, for a nervous system long accustomed to tension, feels unbearable. Prolonged heat makes us forget what coolness feels like. In the same way, internalized emotions make us forget what freedom feels like. We call endurance maturity, silence, wisdom, contraction, safety. Jung called this identification with the complex, the ego identifying with the coat. At that point, there is no longer, "I am wearing it." There is only, "I am this kind of person." But Jung did not stop at diagnosis. He offered a quiet path forward, not tearing the coat off in panic, not fighting emotion, but noticing the temperature, noticing that the heat is real, noticing that endurance is not a virtue. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The light here is not impulsive determination. It is gentle attention to the signals of body and mind that have long been ignored. When you begin to notice the coat, something strange happens. Emotions stop issuing commands and begin to reveal themselves. Guilt reveals itself as a fear of losing worth. Shame reveals itself as a fear of exclusion. Fear reveals itself as the memory of past departures that once caused pain. When seen, they lose their autonomy. Jung emphasized, the unconscious is not just evil by nature, it is also the source of the highest good. What is trapped is not an enemy, it is energy-seeking integration. Taking the coat off in this metaphor is not a reckless act. It is a process. Perhaps you only unbutton the top. Perhaps you step into the shade before walking into the sun. Jung understood that integration does not occur through force, it occurs through permission. Permission for coolness to appear, even briefly. Permission for the body to remember a standard other than endurance. And when coolness is tasted, even for a moment, an old belief begins to crack. That resistance is always costly. It is not. The cost of staying, sweating, exhaustion, contraction is also a cost. Jung wrote, "Where your fear is, there is your task." Where we fear taking the coat off the most is often where life has been suppressed the longest. Emotional control works because it trains us to adapt, but adaptation is not the same as living. Jung drew a clear distinction between mere survival and becoming whole. He called the latter individuation, not becoming someone else, but returning to the temperature that is right for you. When the coat is loosened, even partially, the breath deepens. And in that breath, something simple appears. The capacity to choose without fear, pre-pricing the outcome. In the end, Jung did not ask us to take the coat off to prove anything. He only invited us not to confuse endurance with normality. When we stop calling the heat normal, control loses its foundation. No rebellion is required, no slogans. Only a quiet truth acknowledged in silence. I am hot, and from that small truth, a small freedom begins to grow. Not loud, not dramatic, but enough to remind us that resistance does not have to be costly. When what we are resisting is only a coat that has long been ready to be taken off. And when that coat has finally been seen, not as personality, not as normal, but as a layer of endurance that was learned and worn, then a deeper, quieter truth begins to emerge, and we arrive at a silent realization. A person who is being manipulated does not act because they want to, but because they cannot endure the emotions placed upon them. It is not desire that guides them, not deep conviction, but emotional survival. This is where Carl Gustav Jung most clearly identified the boundary between surface-level freedom and inner dependence. People often assume that if someone repeats a behavior, they must want it on some level. But Jung understood that many actions do not arise from desire, but from the avoidance of pain. When an emotion becomes unbearable, when guilt constricts, shame dissolves identity, fear freezes the future, action is no longer a choice. It becomes a survival reflex. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." When emotion operates in the unconscious, we do not call it coercion. We call it, "I had no other choice." At this depth, manipulation does not need to direct thought. It only needs to impose an emotional state heavy enough to overwhelm. When inner pain crosses the threshold of tolerance, human beings will do anything to make it stop, to stay silent, to remain, to comply, to erase themselves. And because that action brings temporary relief, it is reinforced, not as a belief, but as a conditioned reflex of the nervous system. Jung saw this clearly in his patients. They did not choose self-destructive patterns. They were driven into them by emotions that had never been integrated. He wrote, "Emotion is the chief source of all becoming conscious. But when emotion is not brought into awareness, it does not lead to awakening. It leads to compliance. And that compliance often wears the mask of reason, responsibility, or doing the right thing. What matters is this. This is not weakness. This is survival. A mind surrounded by emotional overload narrows its goal from living fully to simply staying alive." The Stoics spoke plainly about this. Seneca wrote, "A man who suffers before it is necessary suffers more than is necessary." But when fear and shame dominate, people can no longer distinguish between real danger and emotional threat. Every possibility of change feels like danger, and so reality begins to be perceived not through truth, but through tolerance. What hurts less right now? What helps me avoid the feeling of being rejected, being wrong, being abandoned? Jung recognized that at this point, the question, "What do I want?" becomes meaningless. The real question is, what am I trying to avoid? But Jung was careful here. He did not force awakening. He did not demand immediate change the moment someone glimpsed their prison, because he understood that recognition itself is already a shock to the nervous system. Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." And so he allowed something deeply humane. Recognition can wait. Tonight, nothing needs to change. No decision needs to be made. No action needs to prove freedom. Jung did not believe in forced breakthroughs. He believed in settling, in allowing the mind and body to digest a new truth, that many things we have done were not because we wanted to, but because we could not tolerate feeling otherwise, and that truth alone, when left undisturbed in silence, begins to soften the old structure. Jung wrote, "The unconscious is not just evil by nature, it is also the source of the highest good." When it is no longer forced to defend itself, the unconscious begins to adjust. Rigid memories soften. Automatic reactions slow, not because we force them to change, but because survival pressure eases. At the next level, we will not speak about behavior. We will speak about reality, about how reality itself begins to bend when doubt is planted slowly, not to destroy, but to loosen old conclusions. Jung understood that when emotion no longer dominates, memory also shifts its place. It stops ruling the present and becomes part of a larger story. But not now. Now is the time to rest. Rest is not avoidance. Rest is allowing the nervous system to step down from survival mode. It is allowing a newly touched truth not to immediately turn into action. Jung believed that many deep transformations occur when consciousness temporarily withdraws, in sleep, in stillness, in moments without effort. So tonight, nothing more needs to be understood. Just allow one very light thought to remain. Perhaps I have done many things not because I wanted to, but because I was trying to survive emotionally. That thought does not need to be solved. It only needs to be allowed to exist. And now, rest.